The next biogeochemical cycle on our docket is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is the main component of our atmosphere. When we think about breathing in and breathing out, we think about oxygen. We talked about the importance of the role of oxygen in respiration in the carbon cycle video. But actually, most of the gas that fills your lungs when you breathe in is nitrogen. It's 78% of our atmosphere. 78% of the air that you breathe in is nitrogen. And to give you an appreciation for exactly how much that is and for how small atoms actually are, I did a little calculation here. Given the average lung capacity of a human being and how much of that gas is going to be nitrogen, and that every nitrogen molecule has 2 nitrogen atoms, that means that every time you breathe in, you are breathing in about 21 with 21 zeros after it nitrogen atoms. That's how much of the stuff is in your lungs. And interestingly, you can't use any of it. You can't use any of the nitrogen that you actually breathe in through the air, because those 2 nitrogen atoms in the N2 in our atmosphere have a triple bond between them. The connection between those 2 atoms is much, much, much stronger than other types of molecules that we've talked about. But we do still need nitrogen. We use nitrogen for proteins, we use nitrogen for DNA, we use nitrogen for all kinds of organic molecules within our cells. So how do we get our nitrogen? Well, we get it from our food. And the biomass of our food is plant matter or animal matter, depending on what your diet is, but chances are whatever animals you might be eating ate plants in order to build up their own biomass. So ultimately, you're going to be getting your nitrogen from plant matter. So where do the plants get their nitrogen from? Because they can't use it from the atmosphere either. Well, they have to get it from the soil. Now, where did the nitrogen in the soil come from? There are bacteria that live in the soil, and pretty much they alone are capable of breaking that bond between the 2 nitrogen molecules. They're the ones that have the correct enzymes to be able to break that bond. No animal can do it, no plant can do it. Only these specialized bacteria within the soil are capable of doing it. So one of the most important features of the nitrogen cycle that you absolutely have to remember is the importance of the role of soil-dwelling bacteria in this cycle. So on this next slide, we have a picture of N2, the 2 nitrogen atoms triple bonded together, which is how we find it in the atmosphere. And we have an arrow going to a picture of some bacteria, some soil-dwelling bacteria. And through their metabolism, they are able to break that bond and then connect those nitrogen atoms to some other molecules. Nitrogen always forms 3 bonds, so instead of being triple bonded to another nitrogen atom, now it can make single bonds to 3 other types of atoms. So in this case, this molecule has nitrogen bonded to 3 hydrogens, that's ammonia. This one has nitrogen bonded to 3 oxygens, and it's got a little bit of a negative charge, that's nitrate. Nitrates, nitrites, ammonium, these are all forms of nitrogen that plants now can actually take up as a kind of chemical fertilizer. It's a nutrient in the soil that they can work with. So these soil-dwelling bacteria are able to pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it into this usable form. And we refer to this as nitrogen fixation. The process of nitrogen fixation converts gaseous N2 to ammonium, which is NH4+. I don't have a picture of NH4+ here, but there's one more hydrogen and it has a positive charge. And nitrate, NO3-, which can then be used by plants. Most of the nitrogen available in natural ecosystems comes from biological fixation performed by nitrogen-fixing bacteria and nitrifying bacteria, so 2 different forms of soil-dwelling bacteria that create these alternate forms of nitrogen, these alternate nitrogen-based chemicals. Now those nitrites and nitrates and ammonium, those are seeped into the soil, they're kind of excreted out into the soil, and they are taken up by the plant. So on this diagram of the nitrogen cycle, you can see that the nitrogen-fixing bacteria actually live right around the roots of the plants. They live symbiotically right near the roots of the plants. The roots of the plants give the bacteria a nice little place to be able to live. It's a convenient location for them to be able to survive and divide and gain nutrients and be able to set up shop to be able to do their work. But they provide nutrients for the plants to be able to continue to grow. So they have a symbiotic relationship with these plants. They both benefit from this relationship. And they provide these nutrients in the soil, which the plants, producers, are able to take up these non-living nutrients, this abiotic factor of the ecosystem, and they're able to use it to support plant growth, to create biomass. So, of course, plants are the ones that are capturing energy, right? And they are securing that energy in the form of biomass for other organisms in the food chain. But this is also how nitrogen is entering the food chain. So the plants can then be eaten by herbivores, right? The herbivores are going to eat the plants, and that's how we're going to get nitrogen up to the higher levels of the food chain, is through consumption. So it goes to the consumers. Just like in some of the other biogeochemical cycles, when the plants decay, when they leave leaf litter, or when the animals leave waste behind them, or when they leave their carcasses after they die, that material is going to be decomposed by decomposers. It's going to decay. It's going to be left in the soil layer to break down, and that's going to return in the form of nutrients. We're going to have more nitrates and more nitrogen in the soil, which then can be pulled back up by the producers. So it's going to go from the biosphere to the lithosphere, to the soil, and then back to the biosphere again, and it can get into that loop over and over and over again. So you can have loops within loops in these biogeochemical cycles. So let me make sure I'm going through this step by step here. Step number 1, it shows the nitrogen being pulled out of the atmosphere by the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, making it available to plants, right? Now, it also indicates that there are some free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Not all of them live in the nodules around roots. Some of them just kind of live freely in the soil. So you have bacteria all throughout the soil doing this work, and they are creating ammonium in the soil. There's another kind of bacteria called nitrifying bacteria, which converts that ammonium into nitrates, and that's really the fertilizer that the plant roots need. And then that can then be assimilated by the plant. So we have ammonium and nitrates, both of them getting assimilated by the plant roots, which then gets into these food chains. So it goes from producers to consumers. And then when we have the carcasses and the waste left behind, that is what we call detritus. Any dead material that's going to be broken down and returned to the soil, that's detritus. And that gets broken down by decomposers, which includes fungi and yet more bacteria, which will return that nitrogen to the form of ammonium, and we get back into this loop. Now, if the steps I have mentioned so far were the whole picture, just the nitrogen-fixing bacteria pulling the nitrogen out of the atmosphere and then going into the soil and being passed around food chains and then going back to the soil and round and round and round, well, eventually all the nitrogen would just get pulled out of the atmosphere. If the only process we have pulls it out of the atmosphere and puts it into the soil and makes it available to the biosphere and then puts it back into the soil, there's no process then for putting it back into the atmosphere, so eventually we would run out of nitrogen in the atmosphere. Slowly but surely, it would just kind of go down over time. But 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. So for that to remain relatively stable, there must be some opposite process, which is putting nitrogen from the soil back into the atmosphere. And remember, having way too much of a nutrient in an ecosystem can end up being a bad thing. So it's actually really important for maintaining balance in an ecosystem that we have some sort of method of control for having way too much of a nutrient being removed from that soil. So we have these denitrifying bacteria, which fulfill this important role in the ecosystem. One, they make sure there's a balance of nutrients in the soil, but they also return that nitrogen to the atmosphere where it can spread by mixing up in the atmosphere and make sure that nitrogen is available to every ecosystem around the planet. So that's the last piece of the puzzle for the nitrogen cycle, the denitrifying bacteria, which essentially do the opposite process from nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere and putting it into the form of ammonium and nitrates. So we have the nitrogen fixing bacteria and the nitrifying bacteria that take care of that. And then we have the denitrifying bacteria, which take the nitrates in the soil and they return it to N2 in the atmosphere. N2 is the gaseous form of nitrogen that just circulates in the atmosphere. And that's the stuff that no matter how much we breathe it in, we can't actually use it. Only the stuff in the soil can be pulled up by plants, and then we eat the plants to get our nitrogen, or we eat something that ate the plants. So those are the steps of the nitrogen cycle. How is it that humans impact the nitrogen cycle, or how do we affect the nitrogen cycle? Well, one thing that we do is when we burn fossil fuels in particular, we add a large amount of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. So we dump a lot of nitrogen into the atmosphere. And nitrous oxide, when in the atmosphere with other types of gases, can be converted over to nitric acid, which then can return to the earth in the form of acid precipitation. So the pH of rainwater is usually a little bit low, it's a little bit acidic, but when there's an abundance of fossil fuel burning, when there's an abundance of nitrous oxide being released into the atmosphere, the pH can go really low and it can become very acidic. And when that lands on, say, plant life, that's going to end up turning leaves yellow. It's going to damage their ability to do photosynthesis. The less photosynthesis they can do, the less energy becomes available to ecosystems, the less biomass is being produced by the plants. It limits their plant growth, it limits the energy availability for all of the primary consumers, and then for any predator for them. And it's like a domino effect that just kind of builds and builds and builds. So generally, if you have extremely acidic precipitation, you're going to decrease the overall health of an ecosystem in a pretty profound way. We've actually done some pretty good work with regulating emissions of nitrous oxide, and it's decreased some of the problems we've had with acid precipitation. 20, 30 years ago, we used to have a much larger problem with acid precipitation. It's not a solved issue by any stretch of the imagination, but it actually has gotten a little bit better. The other thing we do is we create artificial nitrogen fertilizers. I mentioned that no plant or animal on the planet is capable of breaking that triple bond between two nitrogen atoms in the N2 molecule. And that was true for most of human civilization right up until World War I. Pretty much any fertilizer we used up until that point had to be natural fertilizers, manure and things like that. During World War I, there was a gentleman by the name of Fritz Haber who was working for the German war effort, and he was trying to solve the problem of creating more munitions for the war effort. So he was a chemist, and he was trying to come up with a way to make other types of explosives, and he was experimenting with ways to convert N2 over to other forms of nitrogen in order to essentially make explosives. But he figured out a process for extracting N2 from the atmosphere and converting it over to nitrates, which is exactly what you need in order to make artificial fertilizers. So we call this the Haber process, and since then, we've been able to create artificial fertilizers, which has dramatically increased our crop yields and our ability to produce food. However, when we overuse chemical fertilizers, they can be washed out of the soil when it rains, and then they end up through watersheds. We talked about the hydrologic cycle in a previous video. They can be washed into aquatic ecosystems and just all end up in the same place, which then can cause massive environmental damage downstream. Now, it doesn't need to be as profound as that. Sometimes just artificial fertilizers from nearby farms or even just from lawns and things like that can wash over into local ecosystems. Then you just get a big influx of nitrogen, phosphorus, and those sorts of things flowing into ecosystems that otherwise wouldn't have had them, and that can alter the competitive landscape of the plants that you find there, which might alter which plants you're going to find. It might support the growth of, say, certain types of weedy or invasive species that you otherwise might not get in that ecosystem. This also overwhelms the ability of the denitrifying bacteria to get rid of the excess, so it's going to linger around in that ecosystem for quite some time. I mentioned earlier that nitrogen and phosphorus are usually limiting growth reagents for ecosystems, so when you suddenly have a massive influx of these nutrients, you would think it's going to be a good thing, right? Like more growth, more growth, more growth. But it throws off the balance of the ecosystem, by which I mean the scarcity of certain resources is part of the natural competitive landscape. Plants compete for resources just the way that animals compete for resources. So if you suddenly have a massive influx of these nutrients, it means that certain plants are going to get a major advantage over other types of plants, and they might be able to outcompete them to the point where some of them are going to be driven to extinction. And if some plants are being lost from your area, that means you're going to have a net decrease in biodiversity. You're going to have fewer types of plant species available in that given area. And lower biodiversity means a less healthy ecosystem overall. So while nutrients like nitrogen are necessary for a healthy ecosystem, too much nutrients, too many nutrients, can be a very bad thing. And we're going to see that idea repeated when we talk about the next biogeochemical cycle, which is the phosphorus cycle.